rising numbers of have-nots. But we have long forgotten that back in the 60s and 70s, this idea of a more just and balanced world economic order was credible and seemed almost attainable. It carried huge expectations throughout the global south and was also advocated by eminent economists such as Raúl Prebisch from Argentina, or Celso Furtado from Brazil, or Samir Amin from Egypt. What did this period mean for multilateralism? On the one hand, we had the already described frozen bipolar world with the dominant powers vetoing each other in an endless zero-sum game to perpetuate their dominant position and secure their spheres of influence. But on the other, we had a powerful undercurrent of emerging forces epitomized essentially by the non-aligned movement that kept rocking the boat, using the UN and taking advantage of the progressive humanistic principles enshrined in its charter in order to promote decolonization and the new, different, more just international legislation. That, as we see today, worked only to some extent. The old colonial system was dismantled in its geopolitical sense, much less in the minds of the powerful. In the economic field, the power principle prevailed, but the multilateral dynamics set in motion in those times continued for many years to generate and sustain hope in a better future for millions, particularly in the global south. These were also, in my view, the golden years of the United Nations and perhaps of 20th century multilateralism. Incidentally, they were also the year of my youth, and I have no problem in admitting that there might be some correlation between the two. Well, let's go to the third period that I would call the Thatcher Veganism. You may know this, this poster from the early 80s, which paraphrases the poster of a famous old movie in which we have Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh, replaced here by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, Gone with the Wind, the film to end all films, the most explosive love story ever. And of course, the producers are Milton Friedman and Pentagon Productions and, well, the Chicago School of Economists. She promised to follow him to the end of the earth, and he promised to organize it. Well, there is nothing incidental in the fact that the advent of Thatcher Veganism in domestic policies of the leading Western states, the US and the UK in particular, in the late 70s and early 80s, coincided with their continued attempts to downgrade the role and capacity of the United Nations. Deregulation was the key word. Margaret Thatcher's famous quote, "There is no such thing as society," could perfectly be internationalized to read, "There is no such thing as international community. Hence, there is nothing to regulate. Market forces should do their job on both domestic and international markets. Market forces should also dictate what issues should be placed on the agenda and who should be convened to tackle them. Trade issues are limited to tariffs and should be discussed in the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, later to become the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Likewise, development finance should be discussed in the World Bank, and the indebtedness of the developing countries should be a matter of concern to specific debtors and specific creditors, no one else." The current economic order is the only possible one, and it is the normal way to do business. And successful business, of course, is to be carried by successful private entrepreneurs, and states, societies, international organizations have nothing to say on that matter. Thus, the old East-West divide in the UN got combined with a North-South divide. The latter could often take the form of protracted and inconclusive debates in the General Assembly and other fora such as UNCTAD between the group of 77 of developing countries and the industrialized countries. But whenever possible, the developing countries would seek consensus to move things ahead. They knew quite well that they were the majority group, but they also knew that on economic and social issues, there was no point in getting resolutions adopted by vote, as it was obvious that the industrialized countries would never implement a resolution imposed upon them by vote, even if they saw it as opposed, when they saw it as opposed to their convictions. On very rare occasions, when some sort of consensus was reached, it was at the cost of substantive concessions by the developing countries that would totally dilute their intent and deprive the agreement of any chance of generating meaningful change. The US and UK diplomacies, as well as those of some other developed Western countries, increasingly started looking at and depicting the UN as an overgrown, useless entity that only disturbs the smooth running of businesses and only draws large amount of money from their taxpayers' pockets. The negative attitude of the US towards the United Nations was particularly awkward if one recalls that the US not only was among the founders of the UN after the Second World War, but that President Roosevelt himself did a lot to convince other allies, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin in particular, to join the organization. In fact, the turbulent relations of the UN, of the US with the United Nations has a long history, and it starts before Thatcher Veganism. The most frequent sources of friction were the UN resolutions on the Middle East and on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The US systematically used its veto power to block the resolutions condemning Israel. With the advent of Thatcher Veganism, however, the rejection of the demands of developing countries on economic and social issues, coupled with this old animosity generated by the unilateral and extremely biased policy of the US in the Middle East. And what was emerging then was really a sense of incompatibility of a global multilateral organization such as the UN with a unipolar worldview and strategy of a superpower. This attitude of the US had a direct negative impact on the institutional capacity of the United Nations. The US, the largest financial contributor to the organization, it was first 25% of the budget, subsequently 22%, refused on a number of occasions to pay its UN dues in order to force the UN to comply with its policies, including on internal reforms, essentially scaling down of programs of technical and other assistance to developing countries. And partly these policies also are reflected in the withdrawal of the United States from UNESCO. Fourth period, the fourth of those we listed in the tentative scheme, is the end of the Cold War and what I call the effects of the so-called Washington Consensus. In the late 80s, when President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union set rolling the perestroika, it was obvious that major change was taking place in the Soviet Union. When the change of government in Poland did not, as some feared, end up with a Soviet invasion, but on the contrary, provoked a kind of domino effect in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, the change acquired the proportions of a historical breakthrough. Still, when people started demolishing the Berlin Wall in November 1989, few could imagine what the post-Cold War world would look like. It was indeed a tectonic shift, and no one was prepared for it. Some, like the famous or infamous Francis Fukuyama, called it the end of history. President George H.W. Bush, in his address to the State of the Union in 1992, said, "By the grace of God, America won the Cold War." Much before that, Gorbachev's advisor Alexander Arbatov had reportedly said to his United States counterparts, "We are going to do a terrible thing to you. We are going to deprive you of an enemy." Now, how can one win a war when deprived of an enemy is less clear. So the claim of the American president was obviously intended essentially for domestic purposes. In any way, the end of the short 20th century, as described by the late British historian Eric Hobsbawm, stimulated the political imagination of many, boosted huge expectations, but also provoked deep feelings of political disorientation, loss, and uncertainty, as rendered quite poignantly by the testimonies gathered by Svetlana Alexievich, the Belarusian writer and Nobel Prize winner, in her political essays. As far as the international political landscape is concerned, two views prevailed. One, the West won the Cold War, and two, the world finally came together. Both, of course, were huge oversimplifications. None is completely false, though, and each of them, when translated in a political strategy, produced far-reaching implications. The new geopolitical setting did have some positive effects. For example, the long civil wars in Central America lost their dimension of proxy wars, as they ceased to be looked by the US as part of their strategy of containment of communism. Insurgent guerrilla movements and governments finally engaged in serious negotiations and reached meaningful peace agreements, as in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in the mid-90s. And these peace processes were encouraged and supported and monitored by the United Nations. Likewise, the apartheid regime in South Africa lost its prerogative as a barrier against communism. The abhorrent nature of apartheid remained naked and undefendable in Western public opinions. Gradually and peacefully, apartheid was dismantled and outlawed, and the process, crowned by the first democratic non-racial elections in South Africa in 1984, was also supported, accompanied, and closely monitored by the United Nations. Other processes were much less encouraging. As an example of the recovered capacity of the United Nations to act, some analysts highlighted the fact that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, after a long time, could reach a consensus on an important peace and security issues, and in saying so, they referred to the resolution by which the Security Council authorized the American intervention against Iraq in the so-called First Gulf War in 1991. I personally don't think that's a good example. Iraq, yes, was occupying Kuwait, but the massive American bombing that ensued could hardly, in my view, be described as a peacekeeping operation. But more than anything, this testified of the overwhelming growth of influence in the UN of one and the only left superpower, and this would better be described as a surge of unilateralism rather than multilateralism. The implosion of socialist regimes in Eastern Europe, and particularly in the former Soviet Union, while on the one hand lifting restrictions to individual liberties and political rights, also meant the demise of any functioning state. And when you lift the stone of authoritarianism, someone said, what you find underneath, usually, is not democracy. What you find, more than anything else, is chaos, confusion, corruption, the disappearance of all social safety nets, and the kind of general frenzy of people to adjust to and to benefit from the chaos by pillaging through the debris, a kind of primary capital accumulation. Chaos and insecurity induce people to look for shelter. And the first handy refuge available immediately, without much thinking, and at no cost, was identity, national or religious or both, coming together. The political space left by ideology was soon to be reoccupied by nationalism. Nationalism became a new source of political legitimacy, and multiple nationalisms, and they are never as happy as when they act together, and it ended up triggering a new type of violent armed conflicts in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, and elsewhere, a type of conflicts the leading international actors in the UN, in the European Union and elsewhere, were unprepared and unable to deal with. Hence we have this very contradictory geopolitical setting in the early 90s that includes some successful processes in Central America, the end of apartheid in South Africa, but also new wars in Eurasia and in the Balkans, and never to be forgotten, the genocide in Rwanda. In spite of this disconcerting diversity of situations, the new hegemonic powers, those claiming to have won the whole war, wanted to believe, and to make others believe, that there is basically only one way to fix all problems and lead all countries to the bright new world of peace, democracy, and development. It would be sufficient, according to them, to install everywhere transparent multi-party regimes, legitimized by free and fair elections, and even more importantly, to make sure that governments supply systematically the economic recipes supposed to have generated the prosperity of the developed Western world. All these recipes, without exception, rely on the acknowledgement of the supposedly unfaltering and undebatable virtues of market forces and private ownership. A set of neoliberal policy prescriptions was developed that constituted a standard reform recipe to be applied in all so-called countries in transition, East European and African alike, as if those countries were blank pages with no history, no memory or experience of their own. These recipes became the centerpiece of a genuine new ideology known as the Washington Consensus, and the name, of course, refers to the city that hosts the three main institutions where such policy advice had been elaborated: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the US Department of Treasury. Prescriptions included, among other things, a total opening of national economies to global market forces, a privatization of public state enterprises, the avoidance of fiscal deficits, which most often meant restrictions in public spending for education and health, and the implementation of these measures, it goes without saying, was supposed to take place in a liberal, multi-party political environment. Yet, if and when free elections happened to bring to the fore governments with different social priorities, the new world policemen, the international financial institutions and creditors' clubs, applied the necessary pressure so as to minimize deviations from their prescriptions, even if this implied ignoring the political programs with which the government in question won the elections, the free elections. And a recent, most emblematic case in point was Greece after the accession of the power of the Syriza party. These Washington Consensus policies were applied for more than 2 decades, and their disastrous effects on social policies and poverty levels are well known today, and acknowledged even by their initial promoters, the IMF and World Bank economists. The poorest African countries to which such policies were indiscriminately applied experienced an economic stagnation during those years, while their social inequalities deepened and poverty spread. At the same time, East Asian countries, where the state continued to play an important role in promoting industrial and social policies, as well as in poverty alleviation, registered a 5% average growth. And it is not surprising that such policies prompted popular unrest and contributed to the recrudescence of civil wars in the 90s and in the first decades of the new millennium. The effects of the Washington Consensus policies on world governance were also devastating. Institutional power shifted from the United Nations as a global forum based on a one country, one vote principle to the international financial institutions and rich country informal groups such as the G7. This, in my view, is a demise of true multilateralism in favor of the rule of the few. However, it is not poverty in Africa or the rising inequalities in Eastern Europe that triggered doubts in the unfaltering virtues of a perfect free market, quote unquote. Two major events prompted these doubts. First, the 2008 financial crisis administered a strong blow to the true believers in free markets. And second, the second event was the geopolitical shift in economic power. The dominance of the West became less pronounced and less obvious. The BRICS, the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, emerged as the new players with the ability to distort and disrupt the old Bretton Woods system. Smaller countries in the global south, African countries in particular, suddenly realized that they had a choice, that they were no longer held prisoners of the conditionalities imposed by the Washington Consensus policies, that they were able to choose among different investors and creditors and consequently opt for the development models they felt more comfortable with. This is a scheme of the recipes of the Washington Consensus. So shifts in economic hegemony entailed shifts in political influence. China doesn't make its investments conditional upon the acceptance of certain standards in the field of human rights, fight against corruption, protection of minorities, organization of transparent elections, etc. The new BRICS investors often come with longer-term strategic objectives and do not necessarily expect quick returns on their capital. China understood the importance of infrastructure and started building roads and railroads networks across Africa and Asia. Unlike Europe or the US, it refrained from offering political advice. It did so in the past, very much so, but in the last 10 years, much less so. On the contrary, these investments came with a kind of politically forthcoming signals, as if when, for example, China graciously donated African countries the new meeting point. China built the new palace hosting the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa. And columnists have named this new phenomenon the Beijing consensus. Multilateralism today. How do we envision the future? For nearly 2 decades, the United Nations has faced financial difficulties and it has been forced to cut back on important programs in all areas, even as new mandates have arisen. The United Nations and all its agencies and funds spend about $30 billion each year, or about $4 US dollars for each of the world's inhabitants. A relatively small sum compared to most government budgets and less than 3% of the world's military spending. So it is sad and pathetic to watch this large UN body, one of the most effective by all criteria, such as the UNHCR, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, having to beg donors for money to help rescuing those whose very lives are threatened by war, by religious or nationalistic intolerance, or natural disasters like desertification. What I call demise in multilateralism has many phases, of course, and not all of them are financial. Sometimes it has a foretaste of a new Cold War, like when the US withdraws from the nuclear intermediate range treaty on continental forces with Russia. On other occasions, it looks like sarcastic mocking of scientific evidence, as when the same superpower withdraws from the Paris Agreement on climate change, an initial and still very, very shy attempt to institutionalize a kind of collective responsibility for maintaining a livable environment on this planet. The European Union itself, which claims to be more supportive of multilateralism than other large players, is giving a poor image of itself. It has practically closed its external borders to refugees and asylum seekers, and chosen to ignore its international commitments on these issues, or to say the least, to implement them in a very restrictive way. Increasingly, the EU member states go as far as to prevent NGOs and humanitarian associations from rescuing boat people in the Mediterranean. Only when images of drowning people threaten to turn public opinions against them, some governments reluctantly authorize the entry of a handful of migrants here and there on an ad hoc basis and without any longer-term plans or commitments. I'm less knowledgeable about the situation in the South China Sea, but the sort of multilateral harmony there is not apparently about to be established either. The looming environmental disasters, climate change, desertification of vast areas of the human habitat, the sinking of others under the rising sea levels, the fast depletion of vital and finite resources,